Sarah stood at the entrance of the plane, her nerves tingling with excitement, as she gazed down at the long line of passengers, making their way down the narrow aisle. Some seemed eager to get to their seats, others shuffled with that familiar hesitation that comes with air travel. But to Sarah, it was just another routine day at work. Her polished uniform fit perfectly. The new set of heels made her feel confident. She checked the boarding pass of the next passenger, a frail elderly man who moved slowly but with purpose, his warm brown briefcase dangling from his hand like an old relic from another time. Sarah sighed inwardly. It was going to be one of those flights, she thought, the kind where the elderly passengers always seemed to need extra help. They struggled with their bags or seats, or just seemed a little too frail for the fast-paced flight routine that Sarah and the crew had mastered. She had a job to do, and it was her responsibility to keep things running smoothly, even if some passengers made things harder than they needed to be. As the man approached her, she couldn't help but notice the deep lines on his face. His eyes were sharp. Despite his age, there was something about him that made Sarah pause for a second, just a fleeting moment. She noticed how steady his gaze was, how his every step seemed to be deliberate yet slow, like someone who knew exactly where they were going, even though his body might be betraying him. His hair was thin and silvery gray, but his posture was straight, as if he carried the weight of something far heavier than just years. Sarah smiled politely as she guided him toward his seat, but she couldn't hide the slight edge in her tone as she asked him to store his briefcase overhead. "Let me help you with that, sir," she said with forced cheerfulness, offering a hand as he reached for his bag. He smiled faintly, his eyes twinkling, as he slowly handed it to her with surprising strength for someone who looked so frail. "Thank you, miss." His voice was low and calm, not at all shaky the way she expected from someone his age. Sarah helped him place the briefcase in the overhead compartment, making a point to roll her eyes when his movements seemed to take longer than necessary. She had no patience for elderly passengers who slowed down the boarding process. She could already feel the other flight attendants giving her sidelong glances. It was as if they knew exactly what she was thinking. Sarah cleared her throat and stood back as the man settled into his seat, but not without making a subtle comment to one of her colleagues who had walked by. "Another one who thinks the world moves at his pace," she muttered, just loud enough to be overheard. Her colleague chuckled softly, but the elderly man seemed oblivious to the comment. He just smiled and adjusted his jacket before sitting back in his seat, his hands folded neatly on his lap. Sarah didn't think much of it as she moved on to attend to the other passengers. She couldn't help herself, though she glanced back at the man once more, watching how calmly he settled in while everyone else seemed so hurried and frantic. It was as if he was in a world of his own, one where time didn't quite hold the same power that it did over everyone else. She couldn't shake the thought as she walked down the aisle, helping the other passengers with their bags, making small talk. As she went, the old man's face stuck in her mind for some reason. Even though she tried to push it away, why was he so calm? Why did he seem so different from everyone else? Could it be the silence in his eyes, the quiet confidence that seemed to pulse just beneath the surface? The plane started to fill up, and the bustle of passengers finally died down. The engines hummed as they began their ascent into the sky. Sarah took her place at the front of the cabin, going through the safety procedures for the 100th time, her eyes scanning the aisles, watching for any sign of trouble. But it was then that she noticed something strange. The old man was still staring at her. He wasn't watching the seatbelt signs or the safety instructions. He was looking directly at her, his gaze unwavering. And for the first time, Sarah felt a slight unease crawl up her spine. She dismissed it quickly. It was probably nothing, just the weariness of a long flight ahead. Or maybe it was her own nerves playing tricks on her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this man wasn't just any old passenger, and that unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. The flight was smooth, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She couldn't stop glancing at the elderly man, who was still sitting quietly, as if the world around him didn't matter. she was trying to keep busy serving drinks and making small talk with the other passengers. But every time her eyes drifted toward him, he was always looking back at her, not in an aggressive way, but in a way that felt almost knowing. It was as if he could see right through her. His steady gaze unsettled her more than she cared to admit, and she found herself getting distracted by it, no matter how hard she tried to focus on her duties. As the hours passed, the other passengers began to relax. Some of them were already snoozing, while others chatted in hushed tones. But the man remained awake, his eyes never leaving her. He wasn't staring exactly, but there was something intense about the way he looked at her, and she began to wonder if he was aware of her thoughts. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks. But the more she tried to ignore him, the more she found herself drawn to him in some inexplicable way. She shook her head, trying to clear the thoughts from her mind, but she couldn't help herself. She decided to ask him if he needed anything, perhaps, that would break the tension and give her some clarity. "Excuse me, sir," she said, walking over to his row. He looked up at her with that same calm smile. "Can I get you something to drink, or maybe a blanket?" she asked, her voice a little more formal than usual. He paused for a moment, as if considering her offer, then shook his head slowly. "No, thank you, miss, I'm quite comfortable." His voice was soft, but there was an undercurrent of something else in his tone, something that hinted at a depth beyond his age. Sarah nodded politely, though she couldn't help but feel like he was being more than just courteous. There was an almost deliberate quality to his words, as if he was choosing each one carefully. She turned to leave, but then something strange happened. As she was about to move down the aisle, he spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're wondering why I'm still awake, aren't you?" His words caught her off guard. Her steps faltered, and she turned back to face him. His eyes were still fixed on hers, and for the first time she felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't know what you mean, sir," she replied, though she knew exactly what he meant. She had been wondering that very thing since the moment she had noticed him. He smiled faintly and leaned forward just slightly. "It's because I've been awake for far longer than you think." He said, his words a little cryptic, but somehow clear. Sarah frowned, confused but intrigued. "What do you mean?" she asked, before she could stop herself. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sat back in his seat and folded his hands neatly in his lap. Sarah waited for him to continue, but the moment stretched out uncomfortably. The man's presence was so calm, so measured, that it made her feel like she was the one who was out of place. Finally he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've seen things in my life, things that most people can't even begin to understand." His eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment Sarah felt a strange connection, like he was revealing something that only she was meant to hear, something personal and important, but she wasn't sure what it meant. Before she could respond, a sudden noise from the back of the plane broke their moment of quiet. It was a loud crash, followed by shouting. Passengers began to stir and look toward the commotion. The flight attendants quickly started moving down the aisle, trying to maintain order. But Sarah couldn't stop staring at the man. His gaze was still fixed on her, and somehow she knew that he wasn't just a helpless old man. He was something more, something far more capable than she had ever imagined. As the commotion grew louder, Sarah's heartbeat quickened. She turned to help, but the man stopped her with a subtle gesture, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't need to say a word, but somehow she understood that he was in control of this situation. In a way, she wasn't. His calm was a stark contrast to the rising panic around them, and Sarah felt a strange sense of unease settle deep in her chest. This wasn't just a regular flight anymore. Something was about to happen, and she had no idea what part this old man would play in it. But she knew she wouldn't forget the moment she had just shared with him. The shouting from the back of the plane grew louder, and Sarah's heart raced. She could hear the panic in the voices of the passengers as they stood up from their seats, some trying to peer toward the commotion, others nervously looking around. Sarah could feel the tension spreading through the cabin, Like an electric charge, she quickly turned and moved toward the back. But before she could take a step, the elderly man raised his hand in a calm, deliberate motion. "Stay where you are." His voice was soft, but firm enough to stop Sarah in her tracks. His eyes locked onto hers again, with that same steady gaze that made her feel like she was the one on trial, not him. She hesitated, looking between him and the growing chaos at the back of the plane. "What are you talking about? We need to help," she said, her voice laced with urgency, but he didn't waver. "No," he said simply, his voice calm, as if the world around them was moving in slow motion. "You don't need to help." His words were like a quiet command that she couldn't explain, but somehow understood. The air between them seemed to hum with something unspoken. The sounds from the back of the plane were growing louder. Now Sarah could hear people screaming. She wanted to move, but something in the man's eyes stopped her. He wasn't just an old man sitting on a plane. He was something else, someone with a presence that made everything else seem irrelevant, as if nothing could touch him or affect him. And somehow that made her more nervous than anything else. The flight attendants were scrambling, trying to contain the situation, but it was clear that things were spiraling out of control. Sarah's eyes flicked back to the elderly man, his calmness only deepening her confusion. What was he doing? Why wasn't he reacting to the panic that was so evident in the cabin? Just then, one of the passengers near the back shouted again. This time the words were clear. "He's got a weapon." The flight attendants rushed to contain the situation, pushing people back, but panic surged through the cabin as passengers scrambled to get out of their seats. The noise was deafening, and Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. She knew something had to be done, but her legs felt like they were made of lead. She couldn't move, not with the man's eyes still fixed on her, guiding her like a silent anchor to the ground. And then in the chaos he spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise with an authority that made the air feel still. "Sit down and stay calm." His words weren't harsh, but they had an effect that immediately stilled Sarah's movements. Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't explain why, but his voice seemed to calm something deep inside her. As if sensing that his words had taken effect, the man stood slowly, his movements deliberate and precise. He didn't hurry, but there was a sense of power in the way he moved that made Sarah's breath catch once again. She watched as he moved toward the back of the plane with a grace that belied his age, his briefcase still resting beside his feet. She wanted to stop him, to ask what he was doing, but the words wouldn't come out. Her mind was spinning with questions. The crew was still trying to contain the situation, but the elderly man walked past them, as if they were invisible, his eyes fixed ahead, on the source of the commotion at the back of the plane. The passengers were in a frenzy, pushing past the attendants, trying to escape. But the old man didn't flinch. He simply moved forward with the same quiet determination he had shown when he spoke to Sarah. As he reached the back of the plane, Sarah's eyes widened when she saw the man holding a knife in his hand. The weapon glinted in the overhead light, but the elderly man didn't even blink. He stepped closer to the would-be attacker without hesitation, his voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "Put it down." The command was simple but powerful. For a brief moment, there was silence in the cabin as the man with the knife looked at the elderly man in disbelief, the knife shaking in his hand. The tension was unbearable. Sarah's chest tightened as she waited for something to happen. The situation seemed to hang in the balance. One wrong move, and everything could spiral out of control. But then the unthinkable happened. The man lowered the knife, his face pale and trembling, the fear in his eyes obvious. The elderly man's presence was so commanding that even in the middle of an all-out panic, the man had surrendered without a word. Sarah stood frozen, watching as the elderly man slowly turned and made his way back to his seat, the calmness in his movements striking against the chaos that had just unfolded around them. He sat down as though nothing had happened and looked up at Sarah, his eyes meeting hers once more, and this time there was something different in them, something almost knowing. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. The reality of what had just occurred hit her in waves. She had just witnessed something beyond what she could have imagined. The man she had mocked just hours ago wasn't just some frail old man. He was something else, someone with a presence and skill she had never anticipated. The cabin was eerily silent now the shouting had died down, and the man with the knife had been escorted away by the flight attendants. The air was thick with the tension that still lingered after the chaos. Sarah stood frozen in place, her eyes fixed on the elderly man, who was now sitting calmly in his seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. As though nothing had happened, the chaos around him had dissipated, but his presence still commanded the room. It was as if the world had slowed down when he moved and when he spoke, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something monumental. Her legs finally moved, but they felt heavy and uncertain. She walked slowly toward the back of the plane, her eyes never leaving the man she had mocked only hours ago. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat was dry, her mind was racing with questions that she couldn't seem to answer. As she passed the flight attendants, who were still recovering from the situation, they glanced at her with expressions of disbelief, their faces showing a mix of shock and awe. No one spoke about what had happened, but the tension in the air made it clear that everyone was thinking the same thing. How had the elderly man handled the situation with such ease? And why had no one known that he was capable of doing something so extraordinary? Sarah reached the man's row, her breath caught in her throat. As she looked down at him, his eyes were still fixed on her, but now there was no judgment in them, only something else, something she couldn't quite place. It was as if he could see right through her and knew exactly what she was thinking. She cleared her throat and finally spoke the words she had been holding in. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply smiled, a small knowing smile that sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't a cruel smile, but it wasn't comforting either. It was as if he knew exactly what she was asking, but he wasn't ready to give her an answer just yet. "I'm just someone who's seen a lot in my life," he said after a moment, his voice calm and steady, his gaze never leaving hers. Sarah frowned, feeling a sense of unease that she couldn't shake. What did he mean by that? How could he be so calm after everything that had just happened? It didn't make sense. Nothing about this situation made sense. She had spent years working as a flight attendant, and never had she encountered someone like him. Never had she witnessed such control and authority in the midst of chaos. But as she stood there looking at him, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of respect for him. Something deep inside her was starting to change. She had spent so much of her life making assumptions about people based on their appearance and their age, and this man had shattered every one of those assumptions with a single glance. She wanted to ask more questions, but the words caught in her throat. She was suddenly afraid of what he might say, afraid of the truth that she had only glimpsed so far. He was more than just an elderly man on a flight. He was something else entirely, someone with a past that she could never have imagined. Before she could speak again, the man glanced out the window, his eyes softening slightly as if he were lost in thought for a moment. Then he turned back to her and spoke again. "Sometimes people look at me and they think they know exactly who I am. They think I'm just a tired old man traveling on a plane like everyone else. But they're wrong." His words were quiet but powerful, and they hung in the air between them like a secret that only the two of them shared. Sarah's heart raced as she took a step back, her mind spinning with possibilities. Who was he really? What had he done in his life that made him so different from the other passengers she had served all these years? She had heard stories about people with secret pasts, but she had never met anyone who seemed to embody that mystery so completely. "I've been a lot of things in my life," the man continued, his voice soft but unwavering, "and I've seen a lot of things that most people would never believe." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time since the flight began, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a voice came over the intercom, announcing their descent into the airport. Sarah's attention snapped to the speaker, and when she turned back to the man, he had already turned his gaze out the window again. his expression unreadable. The moment was gone, but the weight of what had just happened remained with her. She walked back to the front of the plane, her mind spinning with questions that she couldn't shake. The old man's words echoed in her mind, and she couldn't stop thinking about them. Who was he really? And why had he chosen this moment to reveal just a fraction of his past to her? As the plane began its descent, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the elderly man had just dropped a bombshell and walked away without even realizing the chaos it was causing inside her mind. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the armrest, trying to focus on the landing procedures. But all she could think about was him, who he really was, and what he had meant when he said he had seen things that most people wouldn't believe. Was he talking about the incident with the knife? Or was there something deeper, something darker, that he had experienced in his life that he wasn't ready to share? The other passengers were oblivious to the exchange that had just taken place, their faces still filled with anxiety, but Sarah couldn't help but notice that the old man hadn't seemed afraid. Even during the chaos earlier, he hadn't once shown fear. He had remained composed, calm, almost too calm, as though he knew exactly how things would unfold, and he had been prepared for it even before it happened. She glanced back at him. His eyes were closed now, and for a moment he looked just like any other tired elderly passenger, resting his head against the seat, his briefcase resting on the floor by his side. But Sarah knew better than to think he was just another frail old man. She had seen him move with such authority, such control over the situation earlier, and it was that calmness that sent a shiver down her spine. As the plane touched down, the usual sense of relief among the passengers filled the air, but for Sarah there was only confusion and curiosity. She stood up from her seat, preparing to assist with the deplanning process, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the man who had revealed so little about himself, but had already made such a profound impact on her. The passengers began filing out of their seats, and the elderly man stood slowly gathering his briefcase with deliberate movements. Sarah watched as he made his way toward the aisle once again. He seemed to glide through the cabin, as though the noise and rush of disembarking passengers didn't matter to him at all. She felt compelled to follow him, her feet moving before she had time to think about it. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice quieter than she intended. But he heard her and turned to face her, his eyes still as piercing and steady as they had been throughout the flight. "Is there something I can help you with?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, as though he knew she had questions that she was too afraid to ask. Sarah hesitated, her mind racing, but she couldn't stop herself. "I need to know more about you." The words slipped out before she could think better of it, but she didn't regret them, not entirely. The man's lips twitched slightly as though he was amused by her directness, but his eyes remained unreadable. "You already know more than you think," he replied simply, and then turned to continue down the aisle toward the exit. Sarah's mind spun with his words. She felt a sudden rush of frustration as she watched him disappear into the crowd of passengers, leaving the plane. She wanted to stop him, grab his arm and demand that he tell her everything, but something about him made her hesitate. She knew deep down that she wasn't ready for the truth, that he held in his past the truth that might change everything she thought she knew about the world and about herself. She stood there for a moment, frozen in the doorway of the plane, watching the back of the man as he walked toward the terminal. And then, without thinking, she stepped off the plane too, her heart racing, as she made her way through the crowd searching for him. But when she reached the gate area, he was gone, completely vanished into the sea of people, as if he had never been there at all. Her mind reeled with confusion and disbelief. She had no idea where he had gone, or why he had left so abruptly. Had he known she was going to follow him? Did he want her to find him? Or was he simply a ghost of sorts, a shadow that had appeared at just the right moment to remind her that she didn't know nearly as much about the world as she thought she did? She stood still for a moment in the busy terminal, trying to catch her breath, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of unanswered questions, and the only thing she could be sure of was that nothing in her life would ever be the same after this flight. Sarah stood in the bustling terminal surrounded by strangers and a hum of activity, but all she could focus on was the emptiness. Where the old man had just been, she had felt his presence so strongly on the plane, but now it was as if he had vanished into thin air. She searched the crowded space frantically, but there was no sign of him, no briefcase, no tall figure moving through the crowds, nothing but people rushing to their destinations, oblivious to the strange encounter. She felt a strange tug in her chest, like something was pulling her in the direction she should go, but she couldn't understand why. Her mind was racing with 1,000 questions. Who was he really? Why had he said those things to her about seeing things most people wouldn't believe? What kind of life had he lived to make him so calm and capable in a moment of chaos? She had always prided herself on being able to handle difficult situations, but she knew in her gut that she would have never been able to deal with the danger the way he had. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story than he was willing to share. With a deep breath, she tried to shake off the growing sense of unease. She had no choice but to move on with her day. She had a job to do after all. But as she moved through the terminal, her thoughts kept drifting back to him, to the quiet authority he had exuded in such a terrifying moment. It was like he had known exactly how the situation would unfold, and yet there he was acting as if he had seen worse 1,000 times before. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of man was capable of that kind of calm. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from one of the other flight attendants, asking if everything was okay. Sarah quickly typed back a short response and slipped the phone back into her pocket. She had to keep moving. She had to get back to her routine. But her feet felt heavy as she walked through the airport. Her mind was still spinning with questions about the man and why she couldn't let go of the strange connection she had felt with him. Just as she was about to turn the corner into the baggage claim area, she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a familiar figure standing near the exit, his back to her. But there was no mistaking the tall frame or the briefcase leaning against his leg. It was him, the old man, standing alone in the middle of the crowd, as though he was waiting for something or someone. Without thinking, Sarah found herself walking toward him, her heart racing again, with a mix of curiosity and confusion. She had to know who he was, what he had meant. When he said he had seen things she couldn't even imagine, she had to understand why he had appeared on that flight in the first place, and why she couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter wasn't just some random coincidence. As she got closer, he turned slightly, his eyes locking onto hers with that same steady gaze that had unnerved her on the plane. His lips curled into a small smile, but there was something distant about it, something as if he knew something she didn't. "Looking for me?" His voice was calm, but there was a quiet edge to it now, a recognition in his tone that made Sarah stop in her tracks. She didn't know what to say to him. What could she possibly say after everything that had happened? But the words were already forming in her mind. "I need to know more about you," she said before she could stop herself. The words felt like a release, like a confession she hadn't even realized she needed to make. He didn't answer immediately. He simply studied her with those piercing eyes, as though he were weighing something in his mind, as if deciding whether or not to share whatever secret he held so carefully behind his gaze. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he said after a long pause, his voice softer now, but still carrying that sense of authority that had captivated her so much earlier on the flight. Sarah's frustration built again. She wanted to shout at him, demand that he explain himself, tell her what he had meant when he said those words, but instead she stood there frozen. She had always thought she knew how to handle a situation, but this man was different. He was something else entirely. For a moment, the only sound in the terminal was the distant murmur of conversations and the soft click of luggage wheels against the floor. Then the old man spoke again, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lies we tell ourselves. He said his words so cryptic that Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. But before she could process what he meant, he turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, staring after him, with her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why, but she couldn't just let him go, not like this, not without getting answers. She had to know what he meant by those words. Had he been warning her? Or was he just toying with her? She couldn't tell. But the need for answers had never felt so urgent. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah realized that she wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. She was part of something much bigger, something that had begun when the old man stepped onto her plane. Sarah stood there watching him disappear into the crowd, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to follow him, but her legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. She didn't know why, but something deep inside her screamed that she couldn't just let him go that easily. She had already come so close to uncovering the truth about him. But now he was slipping away from her once again, as if he was a ghost fading into the shadows of the terminal. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the crowd frantically as she searched for any sign of him. But he was nowhere to be seen. He had disappeared completely, just as he had earlier on the plane, as though he were some sort of phantom that only existed when he wanted to be seen and vanished when he didn't. Her frustration boiled over. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led in circles, like a puppet on a string, by someone who knew exactly how to play the game. She had to know more about him. She couldn't let him slip away again. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed through the crowd, her eyes locked on the exit, where he had disappeared just moments ago. She wasn't sure where she was going, but her gut told her that he was close. She could feel it. She just needed to find him before it was too late. She rounded the corner of the terminal and stopped dead in her tracks, her breath caught in her throat, because there he was standing by the wall near a set of doors, his briefcase still at his side. But now he was looking right at her, his gaze steady as ever, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition in his eyes. He didn't speak at first, just watched her approach his lips, forming a slight smile that made her feel both unnerved and oddly comforted at the same time, like a puzzle piece sliding into place, just when she thought she might never find the answer. "I knew you'd come," he said finally, his voice quiet, but filled with an undeniable certainty. It was as if he had been expecting her all along. Sarah stopped a few feet away from him, her mind spinning with questions and emotions. She wanted to yell at him, demand to know everything about him. But instead, all she could manage was a quiet, "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to study her face, as though he were looking for something in her eyes, something that would tell him whether or not she was truly ready to understand the truth. "You're not ready," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach drop. It wasn't a refusal, it was a warning, and it made her more desperate than ever to push in for answers. "Why won't you tell me what you know?" she asked, her voice trembling now, her frustration giving way to a mix of fear and curiosity. She had never felt so helpless in her life. Every instinct told her that there was something more to this man, something far beyond the flight incident and the words he had shared, but he was holding it all back, and it was maddening. The old man took a deep breath, and for the first time since they had met, she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was brief, but it was enough to make her realize that he wasn't as certain about everything as he appeared to be. "Because if I told you everything, it would change the way you see the world," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the weight of his words carried a great responsibility with them. "Some truths are too dangerous for people to know." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, the gravity of his words settling in her chest like a stone. She felt a chill run through her veins as she realized that whatever he was hiding, it wasn't just a matter of personal history. It was something much larger, something that could affect everything she thought she knew about her life, her work, and the world around her. "But you don't understand," he continued, his tone softer now, almost regretful. "It's not just about you or me. It's about the bigger picture, the things that happen behind the scenes, the things that nobody wants you to see." His voice trailed off, as if he were lost in his own thoughts. "Who are you?" She whispered the question, barely audible, but it felt like the most important thing she had ever asked him. The old man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked away, his gaze distant and troubled, as if he were reliving something painful, something that had marked him forever. After a long moment, he turned back to her and simply said, "I used to be someone who knew how to keep secrets." His words hung in the air, between them like a veil of mystery, and Sarah knew that whatever the answer was, it would change her life forever. She wanted to push him more to demand the truth, but a part of her understood that he was right. Some truths were too dangerous to uncover, not because of what they might reveal, but because of what might come after. She had already seen how his presence had shaken everything on that flight. She could only imagine the kind of power he held in his hands, and whether or not she was ready to handle it. The silence between them grew heavy, like a storm cloud about to break. Sarah felt the weight of his words settle into her bones. The truth he spoke was more than just a warning. It was a challenge. Something deep inside her told her that she was standing at the edge of something she could never undo once she took that final step. But the need to know was overpowering, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't turn back now. The old man was watching her closely, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. But it made her feel as though he was watching her soul, not just her face, as if he knew exactly what she was thinking and felt every one of her doubts and desires. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She had so many questions running through her mind, so many things she wanted to ask. But for the first time in her life, she felt like a child facing something too big to understand. He stepped closer to her, his movement slow, deliberate, as if he wanted her to take in every word he was about to say. "I wasn't always like this," he said, his voice softer now, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "I wasn't always a man who hid in the shadows." He paused, as if collecting his thoughts before continuing. "I used to work for the government a long time ago, a life that most people will never know about, a life that I had to leave behind, because the things I saw, the things I was part of, were too dangerous for anyone to ever know." His words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The government he had worked for, the things he had seen, it all seemed so far beyond anything she could ever imagine. But the way he spoke about it made it feel so real, so close, like she could almost touch the secrets he was hiding. "But you don't understand," he continued, his voice low, his eyes flicking to hers. "The people I worked with, the things we did, weren't just for our country. They were for something much larger, much darker than you can imagine. And once you step into that world, it's impossible to walk away from it, not without paying a price." Sarah's mind was spinning. She had thought she knew what was going on when she first met him. But this was something else entirely. He wasn't just some retired old man with a story to tell. He was someone who had seen the kind of things that could break a person's soul, someone who had been part of a system so powerful it could destroy lives without anyone even knowing. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. She didn't know if she was ready for the truth, but she couldn't stop herself now. She had already come too far. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a sadness she hadn't expected, as if he were weighing whether or not to take her any further into his world, before finally speaking again. "Because they're coming for you," he said, his voice steady, but there was an underlying urgency that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You got too close when you started asking questions. They know you're looking for answers, and they won't stop until they make sure you never find them." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to dismiss his words as paranoia, but the look in his eyes told her that this wasn't just some old man rambling. This was real. This was happening, and she was now in the middle of something far bigger than she could ever have imagined. "Who are they?" she demanded, her voice trembling now. The old man took a step back, his eyes scanning the terminal, as if looking for someone. He turned back to her, his face hardening with resolve. "You don't want to know," he said, his voice a whisper, But I'm telling you this for your own good. If you want to survive, if you want to make it out of this in one piece, you need to stop looking for answers. Leave it alone now while you still can." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath coming faster, as the reality of his words began to sink in. The thought that she was being hunted by powerful people, a part of something so dangerous she couldn't even comprehend it, was too much to process. But in that moment, she knew that there was no turning back. She was already in too deep, and there was only one thing left to do: keep going forward, no matter what the cost. "I can't stop now," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I need to know what's going on. I need to understand." The old man's eyes darkened with something close to regret, but he didn't stop her. Instead, he simply nodded and said one final thing before turning away. "Then get ready," he whispered, "because the truth always finds a way to come out, but it doesn't come without a price." And with that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sarah standing there alone with the weight of his words pressing down on her shoulders like a mountain. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: she had just stepped into a world she could never leave.